just in case we start talking about things. Yeah, the contributor side is going to be, I think, is probably going to help the overall success of just the initiatives around KEPs to be good. So,
yeah, and just we're calling it a contributor site, not a community site.
Yeah.
Part of the confusion in my mind is that we have the community repo. And so in my mind, there's a huge amount of overlap between the stuff repo that we want to have show up on the contributor site. So I've been using the terms interchangeably, but I think that's been one of the things that have sort of, thrown people for a loop. So like one of the things that we might want to do at some point, but I'm not sure who or when or how we can go about this, is rename the community repo to the contributor repo or something like that, to help to clarify those lines. But as we did that, one of the things that came up is there is this repo called contrib, which apparently has a bunch of abandoned stuff in it. So we should figure out what to do with that. I think that got assigned to the contribx SIG, and I'm like, that's probably not their thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the other update from the steering committee, and Quentin's on the line here too, is we've been talking a little bit about one of the things that is going to happen is that we're going to get more formal about having every SIG sort of write a charter and adopt that and have something written down in terms of how certain processes within that SIG work. We're going to have somebody from the steering committee assigned to each SIG to help them through this process. So I haven't looked at the spreadsheet that Brandon created yet, so we'll have to do that. I assume it would be probably Brian for this SIG, and it's relatively new, so it's hopefully not too bad. The relationship between so as part of this process, there's going to be some level of insight and oversight from the steering committee to make sure that the scope that's defined in each SIG charter doesn't overlap and that we don't miss huge parts. If there's a question around the scope of the project in general, so if a SIG claims, hey, we're going to build the Kubernetes cloud native database, and we're like, okay, hey, maybe that's not within scope of Kubernetes, then the steering committee will defer to SIG architecture around scope of the project type questions. So yeah. We had a couple other folks join with their Kubernetes. So who's Kubernetes WG cloud provider? Oh, and then we have Brian. Brian was able to join us. Awesome.
Let's see. I'm gonna make Brian the host, and then I'm gonna switch things. So I'll be right back.
So I guess we both can't log in and SIG architecture is the issue.
Yeah, technically.
Caleb is logging in also.
Okay, cool. Well, I've got the recording going, so I think it's okay as it stands now.
So just quick update. I was given an update on there's some slow progress being made on the contributor site with contribx and figuring out the sort of the lines of ownership and how that's going to work relative to the documentation. So folks, and hopefully as that comes online, we'll have some place where we can host KEPs where they're searchable and findable and the whole deal. So start getting more visibility into that stuff, which hopefully will help to motivate the process. And then I talked about the SIG charter process and how as somebody's assigned to each SIG, I haven't looked at that spreadsheet yet that Brandon created, but I assume for SIG architecture, probably be you, Brian. And then just a little bit around sort of approval of SIG charters by the steering committee to make sure that the scope is appropriate, non-overlapping between SIGs. And then if there's a question around scope of the project as a whole, that gets deferred to SIG architecture. Just a quick summary of some of the stuff that we talked about yesterday in the steering committee meeting.
Yeah, the charter is the one thing I had on the agenda. I had it on the agenda for today, and I was planning to do something about it, and I didn't have time, so I took it off, but we can talk about it.
Yeah. Now in the chat though, Doug asked the repo reorg that's happening, maybe some KubeGit repos won't be under GitHub Cube. And there's an official list of repos someplace. Do you want to address that, Brian? I mean, I'm happy to also, but you've been helping driving this stuff.
Yeah, so the goal is for us to have bidirectional links between all of the official project code locations and SIG level information. So currently we're starting top down just to get some visibility into where everything is. So Aaron and I had put together a spreadsheet with all of the repositories and all of the orgs that we considered to be part of the project. We categorized all those by SIG and by subproject. And we put all of the subprojects into sigs.yaml in the community repo. Since then, we have also started fleshing out finer grain subprojects that live within Kubernetes. It is a requirement for any SIG that wants to get a new repo in the Kubernetes SIGs org to vet the subprojects that are listed in sigs.yaml and enumerate any ones that are missing. So a couple of SIGs have done that already. The SIG apps did that. The areas in the Kubernetes are for the workload APIs. And API machinery has done theirs as well. So, there are some SIGs that got new repos that I think did not do it. So I think we need some communication within the steering committee about giving people a go-ahead without doing that. But the Kubernetes SIGs org is open for business.
So it sounds like sigs.yaml might be the place to go to programmatically get the list of repos. Is that right?
Yeah. What's listed there is all top-level owners files for all subprojects. So in some cases, those are in the top-level directory of a repo. And in other cases, they are subdirectories in Kubernetes or elsewhere.
Okay, I'll try to take a look at it. But the reason I'm asking is because, for better or worse, occasionally people want to run statistics and stuff, and they need to be able to programmatically figure out where all the repos are so they can run their stats. And so having an easy way to get that list would be great.
And the other thing we're doing is creating GitHub topics for all the SIGs. So, random people label GitHub repos with the Kubernetes topic. So that one's not really usable, but for the Kubernetes SIGs org, at least I created a bunch of more Kubernetes specific topics, and we should propagate those to all the other repos as well. The main repo probably will just get splatted with a lot of topics along those lines if we apply them to that, but that may be fine.
Okay.
So those are more easily queryable by GitHub. That's why I mentioned that.
And just to be clear, there's no talk right now that I'm aware of around sort of forcing any repos to move around in ways that they, don't want to. I think it's just about, creating.
Probably we will eventually force things to move out of incubator, but we're not doing that right now.
I guess I have one question about process. So once a SIG has accepted a pull request for a new repository, is it fine to make it? Or should we follow up again with SIG architecture? I guess just talking specifically about the cloud provider.
Yeah, SIG architecture is not the gatekeeper on new repos in the SIGs org, other than the SIG needs to have fleshed out all their subprojects.
Right. I guess this is specifically for the Kubernetes org. So that pull request for the cloud provider, the provider-specific SIGs, the provider-specific SIGs has merged. So I guess Azure and AWS and us, GCP, are expecting repositories now. Is it fine to make them now that they're listed in the sigs.yaml for those SIGs?
No, because none of them have looked at sigs.yaml and made sure all their code is enumerated there.
So before creating repositories so I guess this was my question about the working group cloud provider, since they are actively doing work on the cloud providers outside of the SIGs. It seems a bit unfair to gate them.
So let's not discuss that in this meeting because that's more of a steering committee thing. A number of people in the steering committee expressed that they want a SIG cloud. And there are people who are, like VMware and IBM, are currently blocked based on that decision. But nobody's actually pushed that over the finish line, like actually actively working on making a SIG cloud.
Okay.
So why don't you send an email to the steering committee?
Sure.
And we can try to get that moving.
Sounds good.
Yeah, and so the steering committee is responsible for most of these process-oriented things and SIG governance and vetting which SIG owns what and which SIGs we have and things like that. And this SIG architecture is responsible for things in a more technical scope, like what technical areas are in scope for the project as a whole. And there's also just happens to be knowledge within SIG architecture about how to categorize existing code. So that's where, practically speaking, there are only a small number of people who can actually adequately vet changes to SIGs.yaml subproject and new subprojects right now. So so our charter, to move on to that topic, let's see, in the community repo, let me just bring it up so I can look at it. We have the SIG architecture directory. We do have a charter.md. I can post into the chat. So the charter has a few of the things expected in a charter. So we have an enumeration of areas that the SIG is responsible for. Probably needs to be updated a little bit, but some important things are there. Like, actually, is it there? Well, yeah. So it needs to be updated. So things like the conformance definition. So those need to be kind of categorized into official subs projects, where SIGs.yaml, just a second. It's top level of community repo. But the let's see, things that are not in the charter are, concrete subprojects, the leadership, technical, and otherwise organization of the SIG, decision-making processes, and things like that. So let's see if I can find Phil's documents. Yeah, so in the governance committee steering governance subdirectory in the, paste that to the chat as well. In the community repo, a SIG governance, couple of SIG governance docs were created. There's a SIG governance requirements.md, which talks about what are the things we actually need to cover. And there is a template, which can be used as a starting point for fleshing out a charter. Kind of navigate my windows here. So things like, if we're going to add a sub-project, how does that get decided? Or for the conformance definition sub-project, who are the leads of that? So the way we've been handling sub-project leads is by specifying them using the pre-existing owner's role in the community ladder. Owners has been smashed together with maintainers, and now we just have the technical leads for subproject we're currently calling owners. I'm not wedded to that name, but that's what it was already, so that's what we're using. So the top level owners file for a subproject would specify at least owners, approvers, and reviewers. And other roles can be specified there as well if a subproject needs to have people filling other roles.
So Brian,
yeah.
Question on that. There's sort of been a taxonomy developing around having groups as those things. How does that work?
What groups?
So like the GitHub groups, I've seen I was looking at somebody's one SIGs thing, and they had the approvers is actually like SIG XYZ dash approvers, and it's a GitHub group that has
a GitHub team, you mean?
Pardon me? Or a team?
GitHub.
I'm sorry. Yeah, team, GitHub team.
So first of all, GitHub teams absolutely cannot be the authoritative source of information about who is in what role. They absolutely cannot be. There are a bunch of reasons for that, like they're not visible to people who are not members of the org. There's no audit trail of modifications to that. There are a bunch of problems with it. So we've talked a bunch of times about having tooling to mirror the list of people into GitHub teams automatically. No one has yet stepped up to actually implement that. But the owners files need to be the canonical source of information. There is such a thing in the owners mechanism as aliases, and sometimes the aliases have the same names as GitHub teams, which may be confusing, but some people are using the owners aliases for that sort of thing. But the aliases should be of the form SIG name dash subproject dash role or something like that.
Okay. I just think we should be fairly proscriptive about that, just so there's consistent taxonomy across all the subprojects.
Yeah, we need to have a volunteer to go work on a bunch of tooling and process docs and things in those areas. That's not really a SIG Arch thing, though. More of a steering committee / contributor experience thing.
Okay.
I mean, here, we can work with the things that have been defined so far and maybe try to predict a little bit where the puck is going, but the existing SIG leads roles will be split into more specific roles. So, for example, coordinating the meetings and the agendas and those types of things, which Jason and I are doing, that is becoming a chair role, which I think is straightforward transition. And then on the technical leadership side, there are a couple of different proposed models. There's a technical lead model where one or more people can serve as kind of the Uber technical leads for overall direction and escalation and deciding, vetting new subprojects or deciding what subproject an issue falls in if it's unclear and things like that. And then, individual subprojects, as I mentioned before, will have owners. So one possible model is just like a collection of all the owners of all subprojects could collectively decide on SIG level issues. For this particular SIG, I think, I think we should defer deciding until we concretely identify all the subprojects, honestly. That would be my recommendation. So there are a bunch of other things that need to be in the SIG charter. Looking at the SIG governance template, there's some basic things about how often does the SIG meet and things like that, and we have that information actually right now in our README. Actually, maybe that's something that doesn't really belong in the charter. But anyway, just looking through the charter, there needs to be some kind of process for sub-project creation, deciding who.
Yeah, to add to the sub-project creation, one of
Yeah.
the things that I noticed isn't in the charter is sub-project deprecation or retirement or being put out to pasture.
Yeah, that would be a good thing to add.
We added it to the SIG apps one, which we'll be discussing on Monday, because we foresee that might happen with some of our stuff, but yeah.
Do you want to send a PR to the short governance template to add a brief section on that?
Sure, I need more things to do. Sounds great. I know, you speak up, this is what happens. I'm all right with it.
You can feel free to try to convince someone else to do it. Delegation.
So Brian,
I should learn from you.
Yeah.
One thing I want to bring up here is, and I think this is a question for SIG architecture, there's a bunch of code that is, falls between the cracks between different SIGs. And I'm thinking something like, say, the vendor tree, right? And, being on top levels owners, it's not uncommon to get, like those things sort of bubble up there. I think to some degree, SIG architecture will be a little bit of a sort of catch-all kitchen sink for some of these things, unfortunately. I'm not quite sure where else something like, say, the vendor tree and approvals and sort of managing that would actually belong, because it is sort of a shared thing across, at least in the monorepo. You're
saying that SIG architecture should own that, or may?
I'm just saying, I don't know who else would. It's kind of my thing, right? But
yeah,
I think
that might be for the vendor stuff. That actually might be reasonable. There are some other things like build, where probably we could identify some more actively technical coding wide SIG to actually own that. But things like feature branches and how multiple repos should be organized in vendor, those seem like fair game.
So Brian, let me ask this. There's the top level owners file in the Kubernetes repo. And if all code is linked somewhere and we want all owners files linked to a SIG, where does that owners file and that top level management fall? If it's not SIG architecture, where else might it link to?
Yeah, that's kind of my question.
that probably is SIG architecture. There are a bunch of subprojects that play in Kubernetes, so they will have owners files and subdirectories that link back to those subprojects. But the top level one, SIG architecture, seems like the least bad place to link up to.
And I think we also have things like, utility libraries and stuff like that actually get shared widely across the project.
A bunch of those right now are de facto SIG API machinery. So, the used in the APIs.
Yeah. I mean, maybe we should rename sort of like an API util directory, and then it's clear that API machinery owns that. And
we're trying to split those into multiple buckets. Like there are utilities that aren't even specific to Kubernetes. There are utilities that are used in API machinery. There are utilities that are used across API machinery, controllers, kubectl, and other things. So those things we have a common repo that we were going to put things in, although I don't know if any of those code moves have actually happened. So I think in some of those cases, we just need to pick a SIG to own some of those things. I don't necessarily know that everything that spans SIGs needs to necessarily fall into SIG architecture.
I was going to make a similar comment. I honestly think we have enough real architecture problems that we're, behind on, that we should try and avoid owning, shared libraries and things like this. We can just as well arbitrarily choose some other SIG which has people interested in it and that can own it. It's no worse a choice than us owning it, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I just, again, it's unclear which SIG that would be. And I think as we start doing some of this stuff, we're going to find that there are going to be sort of corners of the code base that nobody's excited to pick up, but yet get assigned to a SIG regardless, just because that's the logical place for them to be. I'm thinking like there's a ton of stuff that's going to end up on cluster lifecycle that honestly nobody in cluster lifecycle has a ton of time for, but it's just part of the SIG process. It's getting that stuff nailed down.
Well, it's
So,
better that it's,
I mean,
cluster lifecycle owns
like,
it, but nobody owns it or something like that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm just trying to think like we don't have sort of the SIG utility, right? I mean, so I'm really not sure where else some of this stuff would actually go.
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe we do need such a SIG utility then to own all of that stuff. I just don't think SIG architecture has the bandwidth to do it.
Well, we've talked about renaming SIG API machinery to SIG project infrastructure or control plane or something like that. Like API machinery is used by every single component in the system.
But my argument, Quentin, is assigning code to the right SIG is an orthogonal problem to whether that SIG has capacity or not. It's just and SIGs can bifurcate, they can butt off new efforts if it becomes clear, right? We can look at that. That's why we're building the subproject architecture to create structure inside of a SIG.
Sure. No. To be clear, I wasn't advocating that a SIG not having bandwidth means that it doesn't have to own something that clearly fits within its purview. What I was arguing was that for things that do not fit in the purview of SIG architecture, they shouldn't be owned by SIG architecture just because there's no other reasonable home for them. If there's no reasonable home, we should either create a reasonable home or give them an arbitrary home where they can live without causing too much trouble. And that arbitrary home should not always be SIG architecture.
Well, I actually agree with that.
So if we can find a better place, then yes, let's do that. In terms of we should create a home for them, I think one of the things that we're going to find, and I think the SIG Cloud example shows this, is that just because we think there should be a SIG around X, Y, and Z, we can't make it happen unless somebody steps up and says, yes, I want to pull together the group and form this SIG, right? It's just a matter of, it's a volunteer army. We can't create SIGs without people to back them up.
Sure, but we actually can advertise the fact that we believe there is a missing SIG here, and this is the charter of that missing SIG, and we invite and will strongly support people who step up and want to run that SIG.
And in general, we need to do a better job of advertising where the project needs help.
And to be clear,
I 100% agree with you.
That I think we've got
kind of getting off
ton of
topic.
real Sorry, carry on, Brian.
Well, so the topic here is that what do we define as the purview of SIG architecture? What things are in scope or out of scope? And I think that there is a certain amount of catch-all kitchen sink aspect that we're going to have to figure out. If it's not SIG architecture, then where for a lot of the sort of corners of the project. And I think disproportionately, I don't think everything in that scope will fall on SIG architecture, but I suspect that a lot of the stuff that we're not considering right now may.
Can I make a quick suggestion here? Can we, because I know, this came out of the SIG architecture governance bit, and it came to let's define the subprojects. Maybe we should start listing those out, and then we can list out the ones we have now, figure out the general governance based on the ones we know. Once all of the SIGs have reported back, we can probably, hopefully, go audit and look for all the owners files that aren't linked to something in the SIGs.yaml file, and then revisit, do any of these belong in SIG architecture, or what do we do with the ones that aren't owned? And kind of chase where that should go. But we can probably, in the short term, not deal with the what ifs and look at what do we know that we own, and then we can create the governance based on that, and then deal with kind of auditing what's not owned later and deal with it then.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, I could love to have this conversation all day long, and that's a problem.
Yes, I agree. I agree with that. And we have a nascent list of scope areas in the existing charter .md, and there are some things that are known to effectively be subprojects. Like we have KEP. The KEP process is a subproject, right? That's pretty obvious. The conformance definition is a subproject, right? And that has an owner. That one actually has an owner's file that has people in it. So so we have some starting points. So I agree that we have some things that are on the more obvious side that we can start fleshing out. So anyway, I think we've mostly exhausted that topic, other than asking if anybody feels particularly passionate about helping with the charter.
I really want to do it. But then stupid release is going on right now. So what is the urgency around this in terms of timing?
Yeah, I mean, my week is not looking so good either. So, I mean, there's no deadline on the SIGs to create charters at the moment, and SIG architecture is not one of the SIGs that urgently needs new repos. So I'd say there's probably less urgency on SIG architecture than some of the other SIGs. I would say, you know, for the people who are participating in subprojects like KEP, I think the first thing might be to do is to just like get the subproject house in order in terms of identifying who are the owners, approvers, reviewers, and, you know, like a one-sentence blurb about the subproject or something like that.
So would it be a good action item for folks, say, by the next regular meeting to have identified what we think the full list of subprojects is?
That would be great.
Then that could help us when we go do the charter to decide which path to take through it, as you noted earlier.
Yes. Thank you. Great suggestion.
Is that are you volunteering there, Matt? Is that what I heard?
No, we are asking crowdsourcing.
Okay, crowdsourcing is good.
Yeah, if you have a sub-project that you think is part of SIG architecture, we should have a list you can go put it on it and maybe point to the owner's file for it or something optionally somewhere.
So, Joe, you mentioned vendors. Do you want to email the, I don't know who the best people would be, maybe the SIG leads, to ask if any SIG feels that they own it other than us?
Own vendor?
Yeah.
Vendors are particularly.
I was going to volunteer Tim.
Yeah, I mean,
SIG Tim?
There's only
SIG Tim.
owners of vendor right now, because it has to be managed carefully because of the risks with liability and everything else. So yeah, I don't know which SIG should own
It can be this one. It can be a sub-project under SIG Arch, and you can be the owner.
I guess that seems like the least awful home.
Well, and I think part of that sub-project is working with the CNCF to figure out the tools and the policies around vendoring and dependencies in general. So this is not just sort of like, you know, owning and approving, but the work that you're already doing, Tim, there, which we all appreciate. Thank you. What was that? Oh, sorry. Yeah, SIG Tim. No, we can put all the Tims in a SIG.
Yeah. No. I guess the only question that I have on this is where should we collect this list at? So if we tell people if it's a SIG, you know, where should we collect it? Or are you collecting it right here?
Well, this is just a start to provide some examples. Oops. Let me try
there twice. We see two Quintins. Something weird's going on.
Yeah, and we could create a spreadsheet, I guess. And email it to the list. Since the number of people are not here today, probably.
All right, so what do we got so far? We got the KEP stuff, we got vendoring, we've got, well, the API review, I think is, you know, and the API review in general is a sub-project of SIG architecture.
Yeah, I just added that to the list.
Okay, you're way ahead of me.
Do we add, and I don't know the best way to describe this because it's not so much a sub-project, but the top-level Kubernetes owners file?
Yeah, I think let's add that for now, and we can figure out what to call it.
With an active goal of finding true owners as much as possible for everything under that. But I think to some degree, like, hey, if somebody wants to add a new top-level directory to the mono repo, that's something that should probably have some due consideration with this with SIG architecture.
Yeah, especially as we try to increase the level of consistencies between at least the repos within the Kubernetes org. Overall repo structure is probably something we want to be relatively standardized. So the specific areas, I can just quickly read them out from charter.md, defining the scope of the Kubernetes project, like what is and is not Kubernetes, maintaining, evolving, enforcing the deprecation policy. So we could add deprecation policy to the list. Let's see, too many tabs. Defining, evolving the system architecture, defining, driving necessary extensibility points, establishing, documenting design principles, establishing, documenting conventions, such as the API conventions, developing the necessary technical review processes. We already have the API review in the list. Driving improvement of overall code organization, including repos and feature branches and things like that. Educating the approvers and owners of other SIGs by holding office hours. Conformance. Yeah, so those are kind of the general areas that are defined. So I think some of those I'll try to come up with some kind of sub-project categorization for. And there is actually work ongoing in some of them, like documenting and defining the overall system architecture. I had previously created a document with a backlog of all of the, let's see if I can find it. I was planning to get back to that. Oh yeah, all the efforts underway.
Quick question, and I see Wojtek's on here, he probably has the best answer to this. So I wonder if there's an aspect to performance and particularly relating to architecture, like if we needed to re-architect stuff for performance and scalability reasons, would that fall within SIG scalability stroke, whatever
Well,
that's, or do we want
I think
to be
SIG Scale can come up with a proposal. I mean, SIG Scale does cross-cutting work across the entire project. If it's really, really major architectural changes to multiple components owned by multiple SIGs and things like that, yeah, that probably would boil up to SIG architecture. I haven't heard of any such proposals.
Wojtek, did you have an opinion?
So I think that SIG Scale may come with some proposal, but if it's like, as Brian said, really cross-cutting across the whole system and many components, I think that the ultimate decision is like probably in SIG architecture.
Okay, makes sense. Maybe we should just put that on our charter somewhere. I mean, yeah, I guess ultimately we're sort of responsible for that aspect of the architecture, and
but I would say like
delegate the hard work to SIG Scale.
But I would say it's not really like the responsibility of SIG architecture isn't really like the taking care of scale, but like approving or like consulting suggestions done by SIG Scale. Like it's SIG Scalability that is responsible for scalability of the system, but like if it requires significant like changes, architectural changes, it's like
that's kind of the similar to the role of the API approval, right? Like all the SIGs have APIs they need to develop, but the ultimate approval of whole new APIs or API groups or things like that would be as SIG architecture approval required.
So one of the things I've seen in this release specifically is that scalability is becoming an increasingly complex issue in terms of getting the release out the door, because a lot of the scalability.
I don't think that's true. That's supposition.
Don't think so?
No, we've always had the same. It's been a resources problem and timing problem. It's not been a a complexity problem. We have a handle on the process. We always have, and it's just that the resources have been reduced.
That to me is a project risk. So I guess that's what I was saying, is that there are things like this that come up that are project level risks, that maybe we need to, I don't know who's actually in charge of that. It's the steering committee or if it's architecture or.
We need a better way of surfacing that. I mean, if it's a manpower issue, that seems like a steering committee thing.
Yeah, and also,
so just to be clear, is the problem that we don't have enough people on SIG scalability? Is that the problem?
It's that there's a highly specialized skill set to actually do that, and then the resources required to run scalability tests are extremely intense and costly. So there's a combination of things.
Those kind of resources. Okay, so those seem like largely orthogonal. People and dollars for machines are two different problems.
I don't think dollars for machines is really a problem, given how much money we're spending on scalability testing already.
You're saying it is or it is not a problem?
Well,
I don't think it's a problem.
Well, what did the other Tim actually mean when he said there's a decreased resources?
People problem. Like
okay,
I've stepped away from scalability. I used to lead the group at Red Hat, and I've, kind of in my job shuffle, I've repurposed towards other goals. So I'm no longer Red Hat lead, and there is no Red Hat lead for that effort, right? So, and as well as Google folks, Merrick has now moved on to other things, and the people who were, actively involved, even Quentin too, are doing other things. So like a lot of the primary people who originally started those efforts and were active now have moved on to other things. And at the end of the release cycle, specifically what Jason's talking to, at the end of the release cycle, we found some thorny regressions. Right?
Yep. I agree completely. The folks on scalability here, Wojtek a little bit, and Shyam and some others have also complained that the amount of attention that's been spent from community on the scalability problem has decreased precipitously.
I think one thing SIGs themselves need to do is actually speak out when this kind of thing happens. Just email Kubernetes dev and say, hey, we have this important work or these important issues. We need more people. Like I used to look across the whole project and periodically send out emails saying, we need more work in these 4 SIGs or whatever. But the project is too huge for me to know everything that's going on.
Yeah.
So either just like feel free to send out email to Kubernetes dev.
The first shot there was trying to write the SIG scalability charter and define exactly what powers they have with respect to release blocking, which I encouraged them to do. And I think once the importance of that and the powers is actually established and agreed upon, then it will be much more obvious that anybody who cares about maybe shipping should probably have a person on SIG scalability.
Yeah, that would be great. If SIG scalability can also identify specific roles that need to be filled, like the release team has done, that's an approach I'm advocating. Also, say, look, we cannot ship releases without people in these specific roles.
I think it's more than just a people problem too. Like it's a general UX problem where in order for people to get the signal, they have to run a cluster of size X, right? And there are other ways to do it, but not all of that stuff has been percolated so that it's super easy for any operator to run, a kubemart cluster or to spin up a set of hollow nodes in an environment that allows them to do a set of tests, right?
So that sounds like it needs to be a SIG scalability subproject to make that easier or something.
Sure.
Yeah, and that again is shortage of resources. And I was just going to make a comment that I think sometimes for SIGs by themselves to identify that they have a lack of resources problem and actually stand up and say, we need help is sometimes difficult. I think it would be super useful for this group and or the steering committee to lend strong support in cases like that and say, we believe this is really important for the project.
We can if we know about it.
Well, exactly. And I think that's one of the functions of this group. It's super useful to have these kind of conversations.
Well, not this group. This is actually not a SIG issue.
Well, we can decide whose issue. Is it a steering committee? Who is it?
Yes, it is a steering committee issue.
But I think where there are strongly technical problems, I think that it's.
But it's not a technical. This is not a technical problem. It's a human allocation problem.
Fair enough. Okay. Either way, I think it's good for us to give them support and not expect the SIGs to solve these problems on their own.
No, but the SIGs do need to speak up about it. Like this is I mean, I was somewhat aware of some people at Google shifting around and Tim shifting around and whatever, but this is the first I've actually heard that there's work that's not getting done because they don't have enough people.
Yeah, cool. I can definitely assign some people to that problem now that I know that it is a problem. But I think we should communicate more broadly with the community and get as many other useful companies involved. But one thing I've seen in that group in particular is the work is really difficult, and it's easy to have a lot of talking heads sitting around a table as opposed to people solving the real problems. So yeah, it gets back to defining the skill sets that are required and being very selective about the people that you allocate to those tasks, because otherwise you're setting people up for failure.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to, we're a little bit off topic again. So I think we have made about as much progress as we're going to make on the charter in this meeting. So I just want to make a call for other topics before we adjourn. Because I actually need to end 5 minutes early to get ready for my next meeting. Going once, going twice. Okay,
Sorry, let me throw the one out. Since apparently I get stuck with vendor, does anybody else care about having input on how we manage vendor at this point?
Can email Kubernetes dev, I guess.
I mean, I'm asking this group here before I go broader. I've got 2 different proposals out for changes to how to replace GoDep. One is an abuse of DEP as it exists, and one is actually a fork of DEP to handle our staging mess.
That sounds like Daniel would care.
Daniel
Smith.
He probably will care. I'm not sure that he has the bandwidth for it.
Yes.
So I'm asking if anybody else here cares about it, or if I should just proceed as I see best.
I have opinions.
Go ahead.
But I don't know if I have opinions, but I don't know if I want to care. It's kind of like once you.
I'm sure you know.
Yeah, it's like once you come close enough to the black hole, you get sucked in. So
just do it right. Just do it right, Tim, and then we don't care.
I'm well past the event horizon.
I'm hoping to. I'm happy to fall into that black hole. Hopefully, I'll emerge as some high energy X-rays.
Okay.
Be transformed into a new life.
All right. I know where you sit, so I'll lean on you.
Cool.
Hey Tim, I hate to speak up because I know how all this stuff works, but if you need people to review and give feedback but not decision make, I'm happy to.
Cool. I didn't want to volunteer you, but you were the name I was looking at.
I'm willing to step in and give my 2 cents and loop me in. Feel free to.
But by the way, so Helm is using Glide, is that right?
Helm is currently using Glide. There's a proposal to switch to DEP. We were waiting a little bit to see how it goes and try DEP out on some other projects. I think that the current path was now to make that change with Helm 3, was to switch to DEP.
For what it's worth, all the Heptio open source projects use DEP.
Yeah, I mean, for DEP seems completely appropriate for like normal repos, sane repos. The Kubernetes repo is not sane, and proposals to adopt our sort of staging model have been summarily shot, as probably is correct. And until something like Vigo actually is viable and exists, DEP sort of in its current form doesn't really work for the main Kubernetes repo. We can either limp along with GoDep or we can follow one of these other paths. But for smaller repos, I would wholeheartedly advocate DEP if you can make it work at this point.
Does that perhaps motivate for reconsidering our repo? I mean, if it's one of the few repos that doesn't work with with DEP, did we screw something up? Is it fixable?
Oh, yes. I mean, unambiguously, yes.
Well, we're in the middle of a complex dance of moving things around.
And the problem is some people like the intermediate state.
No one. I don't know anyone.
Oh,
I don't know anyone that likes the intermediate state. I just want to make that unequivocal. There's not a single person I've talked to.
He's Clayton that he finds the intermediate state better than the planned eventual state.
We should sit down with Clayton and have a talk.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it could be that we haven't identified the ideal end state yet, but okay.
So that's sort of where I was going, is if the end state is agreed upon and DEP is the end state, then we're just looking for an intermediate state, and that's a much different problem
Well, the problem is that the end state involves taking everything that's in staging and fully evicting it out into separate repos, which makes every sort of non-trivial change to the system require multiple PRs that have to be coordinated and merged in the right order, and tests will have to change in order to be pulling the right, synchronization points, and it quickly gets ugly.
So maybe that's not the correct end state then.
Of our scale.
I had ideas for the depth folks, and I talked to Sam about it, and I'd be happy to brainstorm that with you, but we'd have to sort of break new ground, Tim, to like really solve that stuff.
Well, the other part is that DEP is effectively declared an experiment, right? And for better or for worse, I don't know how much more development should be spent on DEP. I don't know if you follow that whole thing, but right, but as per the message from on high, Vigo is the path that Go wants to follow, and DEP was a useful experiment.
And Vigo isn't here yet in a production-ready state. So
Sorry, Matt?
I was going to say, just Vigo isn't here in a production-ready state, or even a ready to
That's right.
for us to use yet, and so we're looking for just something in the in-between.
Yep, no, and I think that the patterns that Vigo will follow are probably going to be the same patterns that DEP will require. So fixing things to work with DEP is probably a net win, but it is a big and not trivial change with respect to the personalities in the project.
So
anyway,
has anybody done?
The real question was, who cares? Who feels strongly enough about this to actually participate? I've got Matt and Caleb on the hook for sure. And everybody else seems to back away slowly.
As they are smart to do.
Okay. That is the 5-minute early ding. Thanks everybody for coming, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thanks all.